I'm Paul Latendra, and this is SouthCoast Matters. And she's Julie Taylor.
And SouthCoast Matters is a public access television program where we bring together civic leaders, business leaders, and citizens to see how we can work in harmony to bring a positive impact to our South Coast communities.
And to see if we might have a good conversation with some of our guests. Today's guest is Evan Falchuk. Evan is the founder of and the chairman of the United Independent Party with a CC after it. I'm not sure what that CC stands for.
Well, you know, we're a new independent party here in Massachusetts, and when the Secretary of State assigns a letter to it, we got CC. I don't know why.
That's odd.
But it's CC, that's it. But remember it as United Independent Party.
Okay, but Republicans have an R, Democrats have a D.
And we got a CC.
UIC has a CC.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're so good we got 2 letters.
Okay, good. Maybe they named you after that little Audi sports car, that CC.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
It's totally possible.
That's a chick car, though, I think. So
I'm not sure.
Well, tell us about how did you get from being Penn State, right?
I went to University of Pennsylvania Law School.
Pennsylvania Law School. How you got from there to here?
Sure. Well, I mean, I grew up just outside of Boston in Newton, and which is where I live now. My wife and I have 3 kids, and I was a business person. I was a lawyer for about 6 years, then I was the president of a healthcare business that we grew from 9 employees to over 600 employees. But by around 2011-12, I became, like many people, very frustrated with the political process, where it seemed as if everything was sound bites and meaningless platitudes about things, not real talk about real issues, and believed that as an entrepreneur that the way to fix that was to build something new. And that's where I came up with the idea of creating the United Independent Party. So it's the idea, if you want a party that's, you know, where do you go if you're socially liberal, socially progressive, but also fiscally sensible? You think that everybody's equal, you know everybody's equal, but you also think and know that government doesn't spend our money wisely. But we need an organization for that. And the more that we went through this process, the more that I could see that the system was very much, in very specific legal ways, set up to keep Democrats and Republicans in power and to prevent competition. So this is why we live in a time when the majority of voters in Massachusetts are not in a political party. They're unenrolled. Most of our
unenrolled's by far the largest party.
By far.
Yeah.
And where most of our elected officials at the state level run unopposed year after year. And people wonder why the government doesn't feel accountable to them. It's because it's not. It would be kind of surprising if it were, given how few people vote. So the idea behind the United Independent Party as an independent party, as something not tied to the Democratic and Republican establishments, is that we can elect new people. We can have competitive elections. We can reinvigorate our democracy by bringing new people into it and making it truly representative.
A good friend of mine who's pretty savvy politically, she's a graduate of the Kennedy School. She said, Evan Falchuk, he's a Democrat running as an independent. What's the difference?
Well, I mean, where do you start?
Yeah.
I mean, I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, we're living in a time when the cost of living keeps going up in Massachusetts, but the policy prescriptions on it are almost nothing. We don't see any real effort to address the problem of healthcare costs. We don't see any real effort to fix the T, which Democrats have been in charge of forever. We had Democratic governor and Democratic legislature, and so many of these problems got worse during that oversight. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact that most people do not fit into these old political labels. You could say, hey, he sounds like a Democrat, but I've had people say, hey, he sounds like a Republican. And what I tell them is maybe that's the problem, is that you're busy trying to fit everybody into these boxes. Most people don't fit into them. And the question is, how do we get people into the political process when the political process doesn't want them? It doesn't want them. The science of how these campaigns get run is all about, let me figure out who the actual voters are going to be, and let's focus everything on getting those people to vote. And if you feel turned off by that, great. That's the mentality. We don't need you to vote. You mess up our system. So look at the presidential election right now. You have on both the Democratic and Republican sides candidates that say things that most people hear and they say, there's some of this that's okay, but a lot of this is not right. But it's because they're not speaking to you. They're speaking to this incredibly small subset. So there's things that I really like about what Bernie Sanders says, but he also talks about a 90% marginal income tax rate. I mean, that's not in step with most people. There's a lot of things that people like Donald Trump say that people connect with. But he also says a lot of stuff, whether it's about immigrants or other issues, that you say, that's not really where I am either, or guns.
No, but Donald Trump also addresses our gut reaction, that normal first gut reaction we have. And most of us like hearing that stuff. We might not agree with it when we think about it, but
well, I'll tell you,
coming out of his mouth, it sounds good.
Yeah, and it's because it's what he thinks. It's unvarnished. He's not trying to be soft about it. You know, we've seen, for example, these horrible terrorist attacks that just happened recently in Paris. And the statements that come out from people in politics are always thoughts and prayers with the people of Paris, but not anything really direct and clear that just says, this is horrifying, unacceptable, and you almost feel like you want to use really strong language to describe it. That's what's wrong with our system, is that it rewards people. They grow into the system who really are good at saying almost nothing. And of course, as a person living in the early part here of the 21st century, where there's a lot of uncertainty, whether it's economic uncertainty, fear for security, and these other things, people talking in these vague ways is really disturbing. So we're in a time of crisis when it comes to so many issues, and when you hear leadership talking in ways that makes it sound as if basically everything's okay, that makes you worried.
Right.
What scares me, and it scares a lot of people who have grown up in different systems. I've been a Republican, I've been a Democrat, and I've been unenrolled, probably most of my life unenrolled, currently a Democrat. But what frightens me is the example of Ross Perot, or what was the guy who ran, the car guy, unsafe at any speed.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, Ralph Nader?
Ralph Nader.
Yeah.
Their campaigns, basically, Nader got Bush elected and Ross Perot got Clinton elected. And the reality of that third party just seems to have an effect of doing almost the opposite of what Perot would have. I'm sure if he had to vote for Clinton or Bush, he would have been a Bush man, but he got Clinton elected. Nader, the same. Basically got Bush elected and took Gore out of the race.
Sure. Well, look, clearly I started a third party.
Yeah.
And we went and got 3% of the vote, which was enough to enter the landscape as an official party.
Which is an amazing task, starting from zero.
The official parties want you to believe that it is not possible to create an alternative to them. And they will tell you all sorts of stories. Now, those examples, which were from years ago, the world's changed a lot in that time, when between Perot, Nader, and others. And I heard when I was a candidate for governor, people tell people, listen, don't vote for him, because if you do that, it's a vote for, and I heard this on both sides.
Yeah.
All right. So it's a tired old trick, because what they're basically saying is, don't waste your vote by not voting for one of our people. It's a way to protect the establishment tries to protect itself.
Well, in the past, it has been a waste, Evan. I mean, it's been a real argument. So.
Well, I'll tell you this, though. Many of these candidates that have been fringe candidates, which has really been part of the problem. If you're not in the mainstream, if you're not willing to take on actual issues in a genuine way, then it's always going to be kind of a niche candidacy. And that niche candidacy is always going to pull people from one direction or another, and that does change the balance of how these races work. What we absolutely have to have, and what I'm building here with this party, is a true alternative to the existing system, made up of people that aren't sitting on some kind of ideological perch. People that are just saying, hey, what do we do? What are we supposed to do? How can we be really real about the issues that are going on? So I
know you use the term pragmatic, pragmatic, progressive. Pragmatic, progressive.
That's right, yeah. and it's about being real about these things. So we have all these areas where there's been essentially deferred maintenance. If you don't fix your roof for a while, you save some money in the short term, but eventually the roof is going to have a hole.
We're killing
in it.
ourselves.
So we've got issues around this with healthcare, with housing, with our schools that are falling apart in so many places, our transportation system where the money hasn't been invested in the hopes that one day it'll somehow fix itself because someone else deals with it. Well, the roof's got a hole in it already, and there's water pouring in, and we're still trying to kick the can down the road. Pension obligations. We've got some really, really hard issues. So it's not even a question of being pragmatic, although that's a big part of it. It's a question of, do we have leaders that are tough enough and that are bold enough to say, listen, we have a hard problem. Let's figure out how to deal with it. We don't need to be getting antagonistic or having fights with each other, but we should be willing to talk about how do we get out of these problems together, because these things can't persist.
Now, one thing about these parties is they have these big money machines and lots of donations behind them. So what kind of challenges have you found with starting the independent party and fundraising and getting support like
It's
that?
harder. I mean, one of the things that I saw as a candidate was that before we were an official party, when I ran, the law said that I could raise up to $1,500 per person for my campaign, which is a good amount of money. But the Democratic and Republican candidates were allowed to raise up to $15,000 per person. So here we are in Massachusetts, the cradle of American democracy, and we've got two different rules to participate in our democracy just based on whether you're connected to one of these parties or not. That's kind of nuts. I don't know how else to put it. There's other rules around ballot access. Really importantly, if you're a non-party organization, this is a little bit technical, but this is really important. The party has all kinds of data, voter files and other things like it. If you were a candidate and you were associated with the United Independent Party, before it was a party, I couldn't give you that information. You'd have to buy it from me.
Wow.
I couldn't give you marketing materials. I couldn't give you advice. I couldn't give you anything of value without you having to report it or buy it from me. And it was limited to $500 that I could do. As a party, I'm allowed to share with you in an unlimited way. That's a huge advantage.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of the reasons why a majority of our legislators run unopposed, why in a state where a majority of people aren't in a party, we don't have any statewide elected officials who are not Democrats and Republicans.
So if I'm unenlisted and I'm running for selectman or whatever, I can't even get access to voting list?
You can get whatever it is you'd have access to as a candidate, but the real valuable stuff is what's going to come from a party that's got years and years of data.
Okay.
And you can't know unless you buy it.
Yeah.
Unless you buy it or it's
gets
treated as an
expensive.
in-kind contribution, and it's expensive.
Yeah.
So it's a huge barrier. It's the kind of thing that you would see it's sort of a cartel-like behavior, where you say, listen, we want to make sure that no one can compete against us. This is our playground. This is our sandbox, Democrats and Republicans, and don't you dare come in here. Well, we're in. We tunneled our way in. And what our intent is to make sure we run candidates to make sure races are competitive. They're competitive, and that we can win. And I'll tell you some of the very practical things we could do, even as a first step as a party. If we had candidates in the legislature, we would be demanding recorded votes all the time in the House. Right now, the way our legislative process works is that the Speaker goes up into a room, it's been very widely reported, with his leadership. They basically decide what to do with bills, and then they come down and they just have voice votes on everything. Almost no vote is recorded unless they want it to be recorded for some reason. What that means is all sorts of things that we would want.
How could an independent prevent that?
Well, under the rules of the House, if a substantial number of people, if a certain number of people stand and demand a recorded vote, there is a recorded vote. So we need people that are willing to do that. Right now, with Democrats and Republicans, it never happens. They never demand recorded votes. We need to have people in that office who will demand it. I'd say we don't do business, legislative business, in the state of Massachusetts behind closed doors. We don't do it in secret. But we need people that have the guts to stand up and do that kind of thing. Those are the kinds of people we want to get elected.
Are you getting people that are interested in running
Absolutely.
locally? What types of races are they getting interested in?
Well, this year it was all local races. We had some people that ran in local races. Some did well and didn't make it. Others won, who we were supportive of.
Do you have anyone in the legislation now?
We do not.
UIBs?
So we became an official party in December of last year. So the first legislative races are going to be next year. Those are the ones that we intend to have some people in, and we're looking very closely at a number of races. This is not going to be the kind of thing where we say let's put up 100 candidates. No,
Right.
We're going to have a select group of people who will be people that you'll be able to have on a show like this and say this person is interesting. This person can make an impact. This person can win.
Is there a particular area in the state that you think is more receptive to this? I wouldn't think it would be easy in the greater Boston area, but...
Yeah, it's interesting. There's, you might be surprised by this, but for example, in Western Massachusetts, when I was a candidate, we got 10% or more of the vote in certain parts of that state. That's an area that's really interesting. I have to tell you, the SouthCoast is also a fascinating area for what we're doing, and we've had a good amount of registrations. Here with the United Independent Party, one of the things that we have to do between now and next November is get 40,000 people enrolled in the party. The reason for this is that being an official party, I got that 3% of the vote in the election. You stay an official party for 2 years, and that's it. But you have to get 1% of people enrolled. If you do that, which is 40,000 people, then you maintain that status forever. So we have to get to that 1%. We have over 16,000 people already enrolled at this early date. We are on pace to hit that 40,000 number. And the enrollments come from all around the state. They skew younger. There's a lot of younger people that are interested in what we're doing and believe in it. And the level of interest in this part of the state in particular has been striking.
No, why would you think that would be the case, or what made you see that there was a big interest for that in this part of the state, since this is the focus of our show, is this,
Absolutely.
this area?
There's a lot of, when you look at the demographics of it, there's a lot of working people in this part of the state, people that work hard and who are dealing with the challenges that all of us face in Massachusetts around the really high costs of living, and challenges around transportation, challenges around housing, challenges around funding for schools, challenges around making sure that there's solid job training programs available to people. And there isn't really a strategy that's been proposed in the legislature forever, and certainly right now coming from the governor around how to deal with these issues. So when we're out there talking and organizing and talking to people around what their concerns are, the concerns I hear from people in this part of the state are right in line with the things that we talk about. What's the plan for housing production? How do we make sure that we make sure our schools are funded? What are we doing about rail and other forms of public transit? These are the types of things that people say, I just want to hear some real talk about it. We could disagree about what the right solution is, but I don't like the platitudes that say, hey, we've got to invest in a modern transportation system for Massachusetts and make it great. And you hear that, you say, that sounds good. What does that mean?
What does it cost?
What does it cost?
Yeah.
And where's that money going to come from?
Yeah.
You know, you don't hear a lot of that. So we need leaders that are bold, who are willing to say, this is what I believe on this issue, and to engage people in conversation about it, rather than saying, look, I can just tell you what you want to hear, and that's as far as I can go.
And there are a lot of things that are broken. We talked about the transportation,
Yeah.
housing, education. So I just read an article recently that said that Massachusetts is not really considered Taxachusetts because we have one of
Right.
the lowest tax rates around. I think we ranked like 41st.
Yeah.
And there was one article that said that if we were taxing like some of our other neighbors in New England, we'd have lots of extra money to
Right.
put towards solving problems. So how
Can't
does
get elected by charging taxes.
Well, I mean, you got to generate some revenue somehow to pay
I
for
agree.
these things. So
Yep.
that's why I wanted to know what was the independent party's platform on taxes, or what would you put forward?
Is there a platform?
Yep.
quote,
If
unquote?
people go to unitedindependent.org, they can read our position on,
Yeah.
I don't know, pretty much anything. I mean, it's really very open.
Yeah.
We have in Massachusetts a flat tax, and that means that it's not a progressive tax. So it means if you make more money, you pay the same rate as if you're making much less money. Well, that to me doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right.
And one of the things that we think ought to happen is we ought to have a more progressive tax code. So for instance, if you tax people making more than $2 million a year, charge an extra 1% to people making that much money, there's a lot of money that would be available. But we don't even have those conversations. It ends up being on a ballot question.
Because we can't do that legally in this state
You
without
can. You can
that,
amend
right?
the Constitution.
You would
It
have
would
to
take
make
a
an
while
amendment.
to do that, but
Right.
we should start.
Right.
And our legislature doesn't deal with it. You know, there's people that propose these things. There's some reps who have done some really good work on this, but it never goes anywhere. There's really no interest in doing it at the legislative level.
I think all the legislators feel that if they talk about it even, they'll lose their seat.
That may be true. I would look at that and say this is a very poor sign of leadership.
I agree.
If you're afraid
Yeah.
to take a stand on something that you think is right, and the reason is because you're afraid you're going to lose your job, then you really ought to give that job over to someone who's got a little bit more courage.
The guy who beat you for governor, one of his biggest selling points was the old saying, we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem.
Right.
We have a revenue problem.
We have a series of problems, and
Yeah.
leadership is one of them. And look, obviously you're right when it comes to the imbalance of how much money there is and how much is needed. Take the T, for example. We know this is in a catastrophic state of play. It needs $7 billion just to get it into a state of good repair. $7 billion.
It's the slowest subway in the world.
It's a disaster. It's an embarrassment.
And they're going to take the money from our SouthCoast rail
Yep.
to fix it.
Right. Well, because there's another $2 billion. So that's $9 billion that would be needed to do this. There's another $2 or $3 billion that's needed for the Green Line extension. So let's say that's $10 or $12 billion that's needed, that we know is needed today. There's no plan to get that. In fact, when you look at the money that's being spent right now for the T, they're spending $83 million to improve
Right.
the system for the wintertime. They're doing some smart things to try to reduce costs. You know, they're going to raise some fares, which is going to raise maybe $20 million. But we need billions.
Yeah.
So what's the plan? Now, I'm not telling anybody it's going to be easy, but we need to have some real conversations. Now, this is on all ends of the spectrum, too, because there's a lot of pension liabilities that the Commonwealth has relative to the T. I'm talking about for retirees. I'm talking about the health benefits that a lot of these workers have. That's a serious issue too. And there is a spending problem on that side. But again, the way that our politics works today is, here's what we're going to do. One side is going to tell you, I'm going to cut your taxes. And the other side is going to tell you, I'm not going to touch any spending. And so we end up stuck.
Yeah.
I'm 45 years old. We've been having this exact debate for my entire adult life. All right.
Mine too.
And yours too. And you say, this is not America. We're supposed to be dynamic. Every other aspect of our life and our economy is very, very dynamic, except for politics and maybe the cable companies.
And we're getting passed by other nations. I mean, other nations have better roads, better transportation,
Yes.
and they're much poorer nations than we are.
Yep. We haven't done investments that we're supposed to have done. You look back over the last 30 or 40 years, there's been a profound failure of leadership on the part of the leaders that we've had in our country for far too long. So when we see our transportation infrastructure falling apart, and it is, when we see that there have been deals made, whether it's for pensions or other benefits for existing workers that are unsustainable, when we see that schools haven't been built or invested in for decades, you say, who's been minding the store? Where's the leadership? But it's too easy to go, look, if you watch the presidential debate is a wonderful example of this. You watch the Republican debate and everybody's talking about cutting everybody's taxes. We'll have no one making less than $50,000 a year paying any tax. And you watch this, you're like, where's this going to head?
Yeah.
Why don't we just have no one pay any taxes and have the government write everybody checks? Well, that doesn't make any sense. And the Democratic side, again, talking about 90% tax rates. This doesn't make any sense either. So where are we supposed to go if we want an actual solution to our problems? My view continues to be the only way to change this is not from within those systems. Those systems are set up in a way that is not creating change in any way, shape, or form. They may say it, but at the end of the day, it's not real. We need to build it ourselves.
And I think the leaders also have to do a better job of explaining why we need to raise a tax and what exactly will this tax pay for and
Yep.
what are the consequences if we don't do this. Because I think people are in really tough straits economically anyway. Wages have gone virtually nowhere in 30 years. Expenses have gone up. And they think with their pocketbook and they, okay, a little tax like the gas tax, indexing the gas tax. They had all these stories that it was going to be so expensive. I can't, I don't want to pay anymore.
Yep.
When really, if you looked right at it, it wasn't a whole lot of money extra that you would pay, but it would have done a tremendous good
Yep.
to invest in infrastructure. And Massachusetts is one of the lowest ones on investing
Yep.
in infrastructure.
Yeah, it would have. And it was I was in support of that question. Interestingly enough, when I was working to make sure that we had a vote on the Olympics, because this Olympics was a classic example of the corrupt system that we have today, where a bunch of connected people said, let's basically use the government to make money for ourselves. And people in the legislature weren't standing up against it. The governor wasn't standing up against it. We built a coalition with people that were actually the leaders of the anti-gas tax group. Sean O'Connell here in Taunton, Jeff Deal from over in Whitman. But we were in different places on that particular issue. But when it came to the question of the Olympics, we were together because you actually can build a coalition with people. Now, there were people on both sides, on our side and on the other side, saying, why are you guys working together? You disagree on so many things. And I say, but that's the point. That's the point. We should be able to find things we agree on and do those in the public interest and move forward.
Get them done.
So we should have leaders who are willing to say, listen, I'm going to advocate for this particular tax for this particular purpose. We should also have leaders who can say, we're not getting a great deal from our government. Let's make sure that we fix where there's all this waste, and there's a lot of it, but let's not pretend that there's enough money available just by getting rid of wasteful spending.
Right.
I think it's a national passion that we, as Americans, I think we feel it's our duty to piss and moan about paying too many taxes.
Sure.
I lived in Canada for a while, and when I got there, I was astounded by the amount of money they took out of your pay.
Yep.
And plus, you go buy insurance, you pay 15%. You go buy a house, you pay 15%. Anything else is 15%.
Right.
And I used to piss and moan about it. I'm an American. That's what I do.
God bless
Finally,
you.
somebody grabbed me and said, "You're in Canada now. You're paying Canadian taxes. Our taxes are very reasonable compared to the rest of the world. You're an American. You guys pay the lowest taxes on the planet in the civilized world, and you piss and moan about it all the time. Up here, don't piss and moan about it." So I shut up.
It's part of our culture, and it's
It
part
is
of the
part of our
dynamism of
culture,
our
yeah.
economy, is that our presumption is people should be free to go and spend their money and work for it and get rich, and that's a wonderful thing. We don't have that same kind of collective mentality. But I will say that people are having a hard time getting ahead, more so than ever.
And the middle class is getting
especially,
whacked.
yeah. The cost of living keeps going up, and it's happening in ways that are really well identified. So for instance, healthcare costs, which are a much bigger chunk of your paycheck than the taxes. And I'm not saying people's taxes, they should be happy about where their taxes are, but your healthcare premium is what is killing so many families. And the reason those prices keep going up is that these hospital systems that are hugely politically connected are raising their prices constantly, relentlessly. And they get away with it because it's hidden. You don't see it because it's in your insurance premium. Now, people are starting to see some of it because of the higher deductibles that are happening, but it doesn't change anything. If you're sick and you need something done, the fact that it's 10% more expensive next year versus this year, you're never going to see that. That's what's driving our economy into the ground, are these kinds of things. And our government sits by, and not only does it enable it, it doesn't even say anything bad about it. That's a big part of the problem here. And people used to talk about the military-industrial complex. Well, we've got something very similar going on when it comes to healthcare, certainly here in Massachusetts, but definitely around the country, where there are these connected groups that get away with relentlessly charging more and more money for a service that everybody has to pay for.
Julie told me a story about the baby, having a baby.
Oh, having a baby, yeah. In a small community hospital, it would cost $8,000 to deliver that baby, but to go to Mass General, it would cost $27,000 to deliver that baby.
Yep.
And that's ludicrous.
But the deductible for the patient was almost the same, right?
It was $750 for the community hospital, but in the city, you'd have to pay like $1,500.
Right,
But
and
they've
this
since
is
reduced it,
part of the problem that we have with healthcare. I mean, being a business person from the healthcare world is that healthcare doesn't work like everything else. So if you're sick and someone says, listen, you need chemotherapy, you can get it at a community hospital for $5,000, or you can get it at the Dana-Farber in Boston and it's $30,000, your deductible is basically the same either way. You're going to want to go to Dana-Farber.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so when we talk about price transparency as a solution to this, which Governor Baker has talked about, it doesn't work that way. What we should be able to do is to say, yes, I get it. I get why it would be more expensive to have a baby at Mass General versus in a community hospital. But these kinds of disparities, which are all over the place, that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen. And so we've got this deregulated market, which has been running in Massachusetts for a quarter century, and it's what is killing small businesses and families all across the state. There are things we can do about it. We propose a lot of different changes, but we have to be able to talk plainly about what the problem is before we can fix it.
Well, we'd love to talk about that in another segment because it certainly needs more than 2 to 5 minutes for a discussion on that healthcare issue. So maybe we can save that for another segment.
I can do that.
Good, good. Now, I have 1 minute left before we lose the show. I want you to tell us, you have a fascinating background. Your grandfather went to South America, Venezuela, and he came to New York, Brooklyn.
Yeah, my grandfather emigrated from Russia when he was a teenager by himself after most of his family was murdered for being Jewish. So he was a refugee essentially, and he ended up in Cuba and eventually in Venezuela, where my father grew up. My father came to New York when my father was also a teenager, and became a doctor, a professor at Harvard Medical School.
So you and Ted Cruz have a lot in common.
Apparently, I guess. I don't know. And so it is for me, as a business person, as a father, I just feel, it's like so many of us do, the connection to that story and the opportunity that we really have to build something new to make sure our country is what it should be.
We'll get you back on that. Thank you, Evan, for being with us.
Thank you. And comments, we take comments at southcoastmatters@gmail.com and visit us on Facebook at South Coast Matters.
And I'm Paul Attendra. Good night.
Good night.